Good afternoon to you all, and welcome to this WISE debate. I'm John Vorhaus from the Institute of Education at the University of London, and I'm the chair for this session. Some preliminary points, if I may. The session will be divided into two parts. There will be some conversations between myself and our two experts, and following that, we'll open for questions from you all. We'll have half our time on each. We're fortunate to have with us two leading country experts, Ewan Otu and Dr. Anne Doucette, and they will shortly be talking about the subject of this afternoon's debate, which is measuring progress. Ewan is president of the African Youth Movement in Nigeria, and Anne is a professor at the George Washington University in the United States. And in a moment, I'll be asking both to introduce themselves at greater length, but first, a word about the subject of this debate. No matter who you are, if you work in or on education, you will almost certainly be required to collect data and evidence as some part of an attempt to measure progress. And that applies whether you are a teacher or a teaching assistant or a curriculum manager or a principal or a researcher or a policymaker. Schools, colleges, universities, regulatory bodies and governments are seeking to identify and measure the progress made by pupils, educational institutions, and even countries relative to their peers and their competitors. And we, this afternoon, will be discussing why this exercise is important, along with the challenges and pitfalls that await even the most sophisticated exercises in measurement. And with that, I'll stop and invite our two experts onto the stage. Can you hear me clearly? At the back? Yes? No, you can't. I'll switch this on. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Yes? I'm going to begin by putting a few questions to Ewan Otu. And first of all, I'm going to ask you, if I may, to say a few words about your expertise and how it bears on today's subject.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. I have an environmental background. I studied biochemistry, environmental biochemistry, and much of the work I've been involved with has had an environmental bias. And so the African Youth Movement started as an environmental NGO in 2002. But much later on, we decided to expand the scope of the organization to incorporate other aspects of sustainable development, including education, including poverty, health, and other such issues. So I'm basically going to be speaking from an environmental standpoint.
Thank you. We know also that you've worked on behalf of young people in Nigeria, and I wanted to ask you whether there were some special challenges in the way of representing young people and gathering evidence that you can use on their behalf, or would you say that young people are no different from any other substantial interest group?
Thank you very much. When you're dealing with policymakers, especially from a developing country, you need to give them hard evidence or else you won't be taken seriously. In fact, even when you give them hard evidence, you need a follow-up. I have often told young people like me years back that I've seen so many senseless deaths and so many senseless loss of lives and properties. if you want to confront your leaders, if you want to get heard, first consult them, and you don't go consulting without hard evidence. And then when you get them to listen to you, you consolidate on that. And how do you consolidate on that? You create partnerships with those around them, with those that can control them. And when those two approaches don't work, you confront them. So getting evidence to work from our own perspective has been a challenge. Why has it been a challenge? We said, okay, climate change is happening, but the awareness in most of sub-Saharan Africa is low because they're not waking up to see earthquakes. The only thing that threatens them is when they lose their farmlands to probably drought or when there's flooding. And so we said, let's intervene now and create some level of awareness. And we decided to do some disaster risk reduction surveys. And so we sent out questionnaires to different stakeholders. We said we needed to work with government, we needed to work with community representatives, and we needed civil society to come on board with us. And so what we discovered was when we sent out these questionnaires, a lot of them didn't understand. One problem with educating people is they must be at the same level with you. They must understand what you understand. Otherwise, you'll have skewed data. And also, when you work with government, with civil society, community representatives, three of them don't trust themselves. In fact, government looks at civil society most times like, those guys are always critical of us. So you won't get any meaningful data from them. Because if you want to get data for probably on finance, to know how much resources has been allocated to a particular project, probably on education, they won't tell you the truth. And so to be able to get data, you need to create this trust between the different groups you want to sample in your survey. And then another problem, another challenge that we had was also communicating with the locals, with the rural people we wanted to influence. So initially we went on our own, we intervened with our staffs, and they just weren't interested until we got local NGOs as participating organizations to do the data collection for us. And we had to train them. Why? Because it's easy when they see one of their own talk to them, the trust is there, they believe in the person, so they can divulge the information. So gathering data, meaningful data, that can influence policy involves quite a lot. And to effect change, I've always said, to educate people and effect change doesn't need billions. It starts in the hearts of people. The big challenge for us in the next 10, 20 years is that our youth are not actually committed to learning. The ICT tools are there, but most of them are using it for entertainment. Are they using it to learn? In most cases, yes. You see kids go on the net, what are they doing? They're just playing music, watching movies. They're not using these tools to learn. So we need to persuade them to first take education seriously. Why am I saying this? The current president of my country didn't wear shoes to go to school. He never had anyone to train him. But he had this desire within him to make a difference. So when we want to engage with these stakeholders, we need to first persuade them. It's a moral thing to see from our own perspective. And then we can move on.
Thank you. There's a lot there. I take it that what you see as essential to a successful exercise includes a research component.
Yeah.
Getting hold of the data that you want and using it in the ways that you want. A political component. That means both in respect of the relationships that you have with, let's say, policymakers on the one hand and practitioners and others on the ground on the other, and a communicative component to convince those who are part of the project that it's worth undertaking. Is that to read you rightly? And it seemed to me that you were emphasizing almost first and foremost the political component, the levels of trust between all those who are taking part in the project and those who you're seeking to influence. So my question is, it sounds to me from your own experience that getting the politics right is a first priority.
I would say yes. Why? Because no matter how you shout, whatever noise you make, if the policy formulators and implementers don't get it right, you won't make any difference. We advocated to raise awareness on disaster risk reduction. Something needed to be done to let people know climate change is real. At the end of it, we had national consultations after the surveys, after getting the inputs from different stakeholders. And at the end of these consultations, we had a communique which was sent to the government. So you have to get the political act right. And then you have to get your evidence when you're engaging with them, even when you have the credible data. You need to influence policy. And the only way you influence policy is most times in developing countries like us at the political level. If you can engage with them, then I doubt if you can make much of an impact.
Thank you, Otu. Could I ask a question now about the challenges that you think of as specific to Nigeria and other countries at a similar state of development? Do you think that what you've been describing would apply universally, or do you think it's more local to your own country and similar countries?
I think education is universal. What is different is the context, probably the method, but learning is a universal exercise. And so your society might enable you to learn fast. My society, my situation might actually not enable me to learn fast, but the techniques of learning is universal. That's why we're talking ICTs. So I can use an iPad, for instance, and you can use one, and we can communicate, and we can learn the same things the same way. So learning is a universal exercise, and the challenges of learning are equally universal. I would take just a minute to make an illustration. You want to influence kids. You want them to learn. First, you look at the teachers. Are they qualified? Can they deliver? We are interested in the teachers because in the last 2, 3, 4 years, science education has taken a dive down in most of sub-Saharan Africa. Our students are performing poorly in the core sciences, mathematics, physics, biology, chemistry. Why? Because they cannot give to you what they did not learn. They can only give to you what they were taught. And so we need to address those who are at the forefront of delivering this education to the kids, to the students. And then you talk about infrastructure. Bring the ICTs, bring the computers, bring all those tools to us. If I don't have light, how can I use the computer? I mean, if I go to school and it's raining, those things, those equipments are not useful to me. And so you also have to look at the infrastructure. Does it support qualitative education? So I think these challenges are not particular to Nigeria. They are the same in Latin America, they are the same in Africa, they're the same in Eastern Europe, they're the same everywhere.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And now I want to ask, from your experience, to tell us about an example of a project in which you've been gathering evidence, perhaps to measure progress, that was strikingly successful, an example that you're particularly proud of or you thought went particularly well.
Yeah, we did Views from the Frontline. It's an environmental project. It's a multi-stakeholder research. It involved getting to rural communities to access their perception of threat to environmental disasters. And we needed to work with civil society like us. We needed to work with community representatives. We needed to work with government. And critical to education at that level was local. Local governance is critical to whatever progress or development any community would see. Because the key changes that drive most innovations, drive most revolutions, the ingredients start at the local communities. So that's where you catch them. And so we went around these communities and sent out these questionnaires, recruited participating organizations, and we were appalled at what the results told us. Two extremes. Young people between the age of 9 to 12 and very old people above the age of 60 were completely pessimistic about the state of affairs, about development. They were not interested because they felt there was no hope. In between, 1845 had hope. And so that gave us a challenge to address the minds of the young people, because if the young people think there's no hope, then they won't take whatever they're doing serious. And so we did consultations with them. We went to schools, educated them, you know, at a round table with them, and sent our report to the government. And we were very impressed with what the government did. They incorporated most of our recommendations into a national working plan and sent this working plan to the National Emergency Management Agency. So I can tell you for the first time, because of the data that we gave the government, the president was interested. He said, good, this is a good project. NEMA, take care of this. And so I can tell you that it's difficult working to get reliable, credible data. But then it's easy when you have this data. You can influence policy. You can shout. You can bark. You can do basically all those things you need to do to get heard. But when you go in front of these leaders and talk, and you don't have facts, they will throw you out.
You've talked at moments about facts and the importance of facts and having hard data. Do you want to say a little bit more about just how important that is when it comes to the evidence that you have to share with others, and when it comes to the exercise in advocacy? What role do hard data play, as you put it? Just how important are they?
Data is important in advocacy. I would say most young people, most students see advocacy from one perspective, which is confrontational. So most times when they want something, they must get it. And when they come to get what they want, our leaders will not be moved if we don't have credible, reliable information. Take, for instance, the Federal Ministry of Science and Technology in Nigeria and the Federal Ministry of Education, they are up the hills now. They are looking for interventions. Why? Because the qualifying exams into universities to study the sciences has proven consecutively in 2 years, 80% of those students failed. We don't need any more data to show you that the educational system is crumbling. And so government knew immediately that they needed to make interventions, not just to correct the anomaly. Also, when they get into the universities, do they have the requisite learning environment to study? So they established federal universities in all the 6 geopolitical zones, and they said, fine, let's partner with civil society. Can we have interventions, audiovisual interventions, so that rural communities where these kids don't have constant light and electricity, and also in those communities where these kids don't have televisions in their home, we can create viewing centers where the schools are not adequate. They can watch these teachers teach these sciences through video, and they can learn. And let's see if this intervention will help. So that's currently what is going on with us now. We're working on that with the government, and it's quite commendable. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Ewan. I asked you a moment ago to tell us about a notable success. Now, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like you to share with us some of the notable challenges and possibly even setbacks that you've had, and any explanation you might have for that. Again, in the context of using and gathering evidence to have an impact on policy on behalf of the young people that you've tended to work with?
Yeah, thank you. I had mentioned that one of the challenges is distrust among the people you want to work with. You want to influence policymakers. You want to get communities to agree to work with you. There is not much trust, and it's a challenge. You have to break this barrier to be able to engage successfully and to achieve and to succeed. That's one. Two, local government, local authorities, if you want to work in rural areas, most of them do not have the capacity. They don't have the capacity to understand or to engage on these issues. And so it takes you more time to engage with them, to build capacity, their own capacity first, so they can engage with you at the same level. Three, once you come with a plan, people generally think, oh, there's so much money involved in it. Who is funding this thing? Okay, who is, and you tell them, okay, it's from the UN, it's from, oh, that's good. So they have a mindset of, let's share the money sometimes. And so you need to break it down to get the right institutions to partner with you. Then finally, one of the challenges of conducting credible investigations in most countries is corruption. It's a problem. It's a problem. You just have to bribe some people somewhere in the offices here, there, to get data, to get evidence. You just got to do it, or else you get stalled somewhere. So I think those are some of the challenges. It's not peculiar to Africa. It's peculiar to everywhere. It's a common thing. It's a malaise. So I think those are some of the challenges we have had to deal with.
Thank you very much. In a moment, I'm going to turn to Anne, but there's an awful lot there that I hope we can return to, including in those last remarks, the importance of trust and how to build it and how it might be absent and what you have to do to recover trust when it's lost. If you've been engaged in a large-scale, major research exercise, I'm sure you'll recognize how important that is. Capacity. You're told to work with, let's say, a number of disadvantaged groups. They may be in rural areas, they may be in urban areas, and it's supposed that they're able and willing to participate. Well, we all know how difficult that can turn out to be. And corruption too, I'd like to return to that when we open to the floor. But for the time being, Ewan, thank you very much for answering those questions. I'm now going to turn to Anne, Dr. Anne Doucette, and we're going to have a rather differently oriented discussion based on Anne's expertise. And as with you, and I'd like to start by asking if you would tell us a little bit about your expertise and how it bears on our subject this afternoon.
Thank you, John. As John had announced, I'm a professor of evaluation at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where I'm also the director of the Evaluators Institute. The Evaluators Institute provides professional training to evaluators, practicing evaluators across the world. We are actually working in the Kingdom of Jordan with the Jordanian Education Initiative, a public-private venture, as well as with the Ministry of Education and NCHRD, the National Center for Human Resource Development, which is the external, serves as the external evaluator for Jordan's educational reform movement.
Thank you for that. You've got wide, extensive experience of conducting evaluations in several sectors, and I thought I'd start by asking how, or the lessons that you've taken from evaluations in the health sector, and whether there are any implications, clear implications for education and the educational sector.
Definitely. I would concur with Ewan that the reality is that if we're implementing any kind of reform, we have to have some facts, some evidence that is objective as possible so that we know what we've done. We want to be able to generalize what we've done, bring it to broader scale adoption. I must admit that as an evaluator and a scientist, I've never met a number I didn't like a lot. But the reality is that the numbers have to tell a story. They represent the individuals, the teachers who are in the classrooms, the children who we are expecting to learn and to benefit from our educational reform movements. And we have to tell a story with these numbers. So that's the critical importance. What I like to think about in terms of evaluation is what we call results-based management. This is a business model. And in the business world, we never engage in activities without having some probability of high success. And the same is true for education. We are working with scarce resources, with limited economy. This is global. And the reality is that there's not a plethora of money to while away in terms of implementing this, that, and the other thing. So what we need to do is we need to have a concentrated effort in terms of looking at what we're doing objectively to determine whether or not we're achieving the results that we have anticipated in terms of our educational reform efforts.
Thank you, Anne. Anne mentioned the importance of numbers and stories. It's a familiar phrase, and we're going to return to that later on in the discussion. But I want now to look more particularly at the educational context and to ask a question that was mentioned indeed in the literature on this session. An evaluation for the sake of an organisation, such as a school, is one thing, and an evaluation for the benefit of policy or government is another. They don't always pull in the same directions. Any reflections on your experience of managing those dual priorities?
Well, hopefully our educational reform and the changes we want to make in school will be tethered to policy, and the policies will be institutionalized so that we can institutionalize the efforts that are beneficial to the children that we care about. The reality is that evaluation rather, only works if in fact we have actionable data. Data that informs us in terms of where to make the efforts, where to make mid-course corrections, what's working, what doesn't, what works for whom, under what conditions, and for how long. And this data, in order to be actionable, actually has to be available at the time when policy decisions are made. The reality is that in our reliance, we rely very heavily on standardized achievement tests, and we rank countries against countries, we rank schools against schools, we rank students against students. But the reality is that assigning those numbers don't necessarily tell us what to do next. They tell us that either a school is not achieving at grade level, or a child is not reading at grade level, or has numeracy skills at grade level, but those numbers in and of themselves do not tell us what to do next, nor do they really reflect the kind of 21st century skills that are absolutely necessary. The reality is that our goals of educational reform should not be solely linked to numeracy and literacy skills. They need to be linked to what we call the soft skills, the 21st century skills, the cooperation, the communication, the critical thinking, the problem-solving skills that aren't necessarily reflected in our educational achievement tests. And so we need to have a very complex approach to how we evaluate the efforts that we make in terms of improving education.
Thank you very much. I hope we can return to the challenges in the way of, for example, gathering data on literacy and numeracy levels on the one hand, complicated enough though that is, and what Anne is referring to here as soft skills and what we variously heard referred to during this summit as problem solving, innovation, creativity, and the rest of it. Perhaps we can return to that when we open up. And I want now to talk about evaluating an organisation and the difficulties that lie here in the way of gathering evidence. And what I've got in mind, and I appreciate your comments on, are the difficulties of gathering enough data of good quality, attrition for large-scale studies, that's to say where you begin to lose participants more than you would be happy to lose, cultural bias on the part of the measures, that sort of thing. Any reflections on that?
Yes. A lot of reflection on that. The reality is that evaluation is very, very complicated, and it's complex. And really, my rule of thumb for evaluation is less is more. It is better for us to collect data objectively and more thoroughly and more rigorously on a few concepts than it is to take a broad brush approach and try and measure everything. The reality is that most of the countries in the MENA area and in industrial countries, my country, the United States, already participate in achievement tests. So we have barometers of numeracy and literacy skills. What we need now is we need to look at the pedagogical approach, whether student-centered learning is actually occurring in the classrooms, how children are engaged. It's not simply enough to infuse technology without knowing whether it's being implemented in terms of supporting a learning structure, moving from a teaching paradigm to a learning paradigm for children, as opposed to infusing technology which simply serves as a substitute blackboard. So that engages in observation skills, mentoring skills, working with teachers, working with parents, early education approaches, reading to children, working with them in terms of homework. It's a community involvement that needs to take place. And those are the kinds of evaluation focuses that we should include in addition to the reliance on standardized achievement tests.
Thank you very much. Lots more to return to in a few minutes. One subject being, what are the measures that we need to make use of when we're assessing progress, besides the more obvious measures that are designed to capture attainment and achievement? So, for example, Anne mentioned engagement and participation. There's lots more that we can return to in a moment. Well, we were talking here about evaluating an organisation. I want to turn to the difficulties in the way of evaluations which are conducted on behalf of government and policymakers, and to talk a little bit about the principal challenges here. And what I've got in mind, for example, are the often short timescales that one is given to conduct an evaluation. We have a phrase in England, by Monday, meaning that you're asked to do something on Thursday afternoon and you're expected to deliver the following Monday. There is, I need to choose my words with care, an occasional tendency on the part of some, let's say, to get too close to the research process, possibly even to interfere a little. And then there is the occasional, isn't there, reluctance not to accept messages that are deemed not altogether welcome. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this predicament, and Anne, I'd be grateful for reflections from your expertise.
I understand completely what you say, John, in terms of by Monday. In the evaluation world, we call it time to expectancy. And the reality is that we're looking at how long would it take for change to occur if, in fact, the intervention was beneficial, whether it was advantageous. The reality is that if we implement technology into a classroom, if we change the pedagogical approach by working with teachers, if we move to a student-centered learning approach, the reality is, when should we expect change to occur? Not next week, perhaps not in 6 months, perhaps not in a year. We know that when we're working with teachers to train them on a new pedagogical approach, that it takes time. Teachers really want to work at it. They're learning a new tool, and they need some time to practice with that. As they get more comfortable with new teaching approaches and so forth, the reality is that that's the optimal time to start to measure whether change is going to occur. One of the things that's absolutely incumbent upon evaluation is to evaluate at a time when change is going to occur. All too often, we do our evaluation on an annual basis, and we collect data at a certain time in the calendar year, perhaps, independent of whether we think that change would likely occur during that period. So we can often lead to disappointing evaluation results in doing that without paying attention to when would we expect change to occur. The reality is that the educational reform that's going on in the MENA region is not going to generate change in test scores within 1 year. And what we have to do is we have to educate our policymakers that is foolhardy for them to expect change in such a short period of time. And then we have to have what we call interim results in the process, where we talk about children coming to school more often, where we talk about children staying in school longer, opting to continue past the 10th grade for the voluntary 11th and 12th year education and so forth.
Thank you very much. I think time, I hope, features prominently in the discussion to follow. The need on the part of researchers to have adequate time to do what they've been asked to do and to intervene or to evaluate at the right time, and the need on the part of policy to have results swiftly. That's almost concluded the questions I've got for both Anne and Ewan, but I want to finish with a question to each of you, and it is this, before we open out. If you had, Ewan, just one message, or perhaps two, that you wanted the audience here to take away today, based on your expertise and experience, what would it be?
Education and change and innovation is not something that should be left to experts alone. We must all join hands if we need progress. Religious institutions, parents at home, teachers. It's a multidimensional approach. And so for us to sustain education in all countries, amongst all people, all hands must be joined. All hands must be on deck. That's my message.
Thank you very much. An uplifting message to Anne.
I'd like to leave a metaphor. And the metaphor is education is like an automobile. It's like a car. And the reality is that evaluation can't be adding one more dial. Measuring progress is not adding one more dial to our dashboard. None of us would get into the car and turn the key and go by just looking at the dials. We'd want to make sure that the brakes work, that the tires work, that the component pieces work. So I guess my message would be that education is extremely complex, and that we need to we need to open our eyes. We need to understand the mechanisms of change that include communities, teachers, parents, children, the kind of enthusiasm for learning that Ewan talked about in his opening statements.
Thank you very much indeed, both of you. And now I'd like to open this out to you all and invite you to put questions to any of us. So I can see at least two. Yes, start with yourself. And then let me see two over here. Is that right? Don't let me forget.
Hi, Arun Sharma from South Africa. One thing I've noticed is that donor agencies, they often want data, but they're unwilling to use donor funding to collect the data. They don't want to fund monitoring and evaluation. I wanted to know if you've experienced that and if you have any strategies to deal with donor agencies who take that approach.
Thank you for that. Who'd like to pick up that question, Ewan?
I'll disagree a bit with you. Donor agencies, first and foremost, from my experience, won't just throw money at you. They need to know you know what you're doing. And so sometimes they may not throw money on you for monitoring and evaluation. They want to know if you've had expertise in that field, if you've had any track records in that field before. And so when they're convinced on that, I believe the money will come. And as a matter of fact, gathering data, you won't even be given money without having your evidence and having your facts right. So I kind of disagree a bit with you on that.
It's been my experience that donor agencies often require the collection of data. They don't fund it very heavily, and the kind of data that they actually ask for is largely accounting. How many children went to school? How often did they go to school? And that information is very important, but it doesn't tell us whether the interventions or the reform efforts that we're implementing are actually working. What I like to do when I'm working in development is to instill within the community a curiosity, to create a climate of environment where people are asking questions. They're curious. Are our children doing better? So that we engage them and we build a capacity internally in the community in terms in which we work. And the community can be the local community, it can be the organizational community, the ministries of education, so that they're curious in terms of whether the efforts are working, whether this is a good investment of our resources and funds, and that the capacity transfers from the donor agencies and the outside evaluators to internal resources that are available within the organizations.
Thank you, Anne. There are two questions over here, And there are three over here.
Thank you. I'm Joke van der Leeuw. I'm working for an organization that works on responsible and innovative history education in an international setting. And when we are measuring the results of our work, it's quite often that we are working on attitudes of people, thinking about communities becoming more open-minded, tolerant, democratic, commitment, and that sort of elements. And if you measure that, you focused already on that, there are some issues. How on earth do we get that out? Because I find that very difficult to argue when I have to go back to the donor.
Thank you for that question. Is part of your question, how do you get data on attitudes? Is that part of what you're... Yes?
I mean, mostly it's hard data, facts, as you said. How on earth can I change these sort of elements into facts?
Thank you. So there's a questioner here about how we get data on attitudes, and also something related to attitudes, maybe perhaps respect or trust or things of that sort. Well, I'm sure you've both got reflections, and I'll start with you, if I may.
Those are what we call the fuzzy constructs. When we start talking about not only attitudes, but how people define things like democracy, civic involvement, and so forth. And the reality is that they cannot be measured adequately by a survey, asking people in terms of how strongly they agree. They are best really evaluated and measured in terms of what we call qualitative approaches, interviews, focus groups, and so forth, because it's incumbent upon the evaluators to really have an understanding of whether there is a shared meaning. So especially in the Arab Spring and so forth, democracy may be defined in one country much differently. There are some nuances that carry forth, but concepts and constructs like democracy, civic engagement may be defined slightly different. And so it's very important to engage in interviews, focus groups, to talk to people, to ask them to define it rather than to give them and make the leap of faith that we understand their interpretations.
Thank you, Anne. Ewan.
I agree with you, Anne. And I remember when we did a governance project, civic responsibility demands certain attributes. So when you study that, you want to look at, for instance, a particular area, if there's been restiveness, if there's been banditry, if there's been antisocial activities, and you have an intervention to address that. I think one of the best ways you can have a measure of its success or its failure is in maybe surveying homes around an area that's had robbery attacks. Has that problem gone down? Is it still there? So those are the kind of parameters people want to see. How many youths kind of complained they were robbed, or how many homes were bungled, or how many cars were stolen? I think this kind of data can give you evidence of if your intervention has worked or if it has not worked.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question in a moment, which will be yours. We didn't mention, and perhaps someone might, the prospect of bias when gathering data on attitudes. So, for example, we are very familiar with bias on the part of learners when they're asked, or the need to deal with bias when talking to learners about their classes and their courses and their teachers. They may, for example, tend to be a little bit more positive than other bits of evidence might suggest. You may have your own experience. Bias and attitude is something we might return to in a moment. Now to our next question, that's yours.
I'm Marwan Tarazi from Birzeit University in Palestine. And I think the rule in measurement or in anything is if you can't measure it, don't ask for it. So what we keep on doing, we do things the other way around. We look, what is it that we can measure? And this is how we're designing our educational systems. Our educational systems are designed to measure, what did people do on test scores, all the kind of things you did. I am of the thinking that the only way, or maybe not the only way, but a very important starting point or point to integrate with the design of educational systems is to start thinking of what is it that we need to measure. And this is basically the kind of soft skills, the kind of soft issues that we expect out of our educational systems. And the question maybe to Anne is basically, how do you think you would go about designing an educational system, whereas you would start with a measurement tool to identify the kind of things you want the educational system to do, and then how would you build the rest on top of that? I don't know if this is too broad for the question, but...
It's quite broad, but we'll take it anyway. Thank you. Who would like to begin? You, and I'll start with you.
I think I'll just say something. When we say education, we have to be very specific and be careful. Are we just referring to schools? Education does not just happen in schools. I mean, what of those that have not gone to schools? Those that are doing manual stuff with their hands, and they have to go through training in workshops, not in schools. So a model that works in school might not be the same model that works outside a classroom. And so I would say I'm not a core education person, but I would say it's a bit tricky and difficult to have a one model fits all. What matters is, what are the changes we expect to see? What are the results we expect? If there's been failures, would positive performances in particular sciences or subjects indicate success? And then if you want to see that as the result, what are the things that will contribute to that success? In schools, for instance, are the teachers properly trained? Are they paid adequately? Are the schools comfortable for them? I mean, you consider the infrastructure, you consider the capacity, this could give you indicators. So I kind of, maybe Dr. Ann will take it up, but I kind of make a distinction and try to say that schools are not just the only places where education is going on. In fact, in most places, in rural communities, education goes on informally. And so when I want to make my interventions, I kind of also consider them. Thank you.
One of the big problems is that we don't share the same definition of what an educated child is. If you're the Ministry of Education, you want children to be educated, and you want that to be reflected in the TIMSS and PISA scores. But the reality is that some people will say that an educated child is a child that has a meaningful, purposeful, productive life. And that means that the child not only learns the formal education, formal knowledge, but the child is able to apply it. If I were building a school or an education system from scratch, I would start with and implement what I call portfolio-based performance, where the child is actually asked to demonstrate his or her learning. And we've seen that actually happening. Many years ago, I was involved in writing items for the TIMSS and PISA exams. And we've seen a movement away from the multiple choice tests to questions that are constructed responses, where the child gets to write his or her response. And that's a demonstration of learning. So I would begin to move away from the multiple choice, the right or wrong, to have a child demonstrate his or her learning, and to work with teachers to provide them with rubrics to interpret that. Because it's only in the demonstration of learning that we can find out where the child is making an error. And we can target that error in terms of ameliorating that error and optimizing that child's performance.
Thank you, Anne. On demonstrating learning, there's a nice issue for researchers when it comes to writing and how you demonstrate that, particularly in the context of large-scale surveys. Large-scale surveys tend not to include writing for a pretty obvious reason. We might want to return to writing as an example of a particular challenge when it comes to needing learners to demonstrate something and not simply tick a box or make use of a multiple choice question. There was one aspect of your question earlier which might be picked up by others. You wanted at least to raise the question whether everything of interest to an educationalist is measurable. And some of you may have a view about that. And even if you think there is nothing that is not measurable, you may think some things are so practically difficult to measure, we'd be better off not trying. Anyway, those are thoughts that you might want to pick up. Before we move to a next set of questions over on the right-hand side here, I've got a question on my iPad, and it's from Janet Looney. And she asks this: do some approaches to measuring performance also have the unintended consequence of stifling innovation? Do some approaches to measuring performance also have the unintended consequence of stifling innovation? Who'd like? Anne, would you like to pick up on that?
I think that it has the potential for doing that. In the United States, the test scores are highly important, and children are very competitive. And what we have now is teachers spend a lot of time doing what we call teaching to the test. The reality is that it's something that I worry about in terms of children in the MENA area taking the standardized tests, the TIMSS and the PISA, because there's an art to taking these kinds of tests. You go through the test first to answer the questions that you know. You go through the test the second time to answer the questions that you're almost sure you know. And then you use the remaining time in the test to guess, because you have a 25% chance of picking the correct answer. And in the United States, there's a lot of skepticism in terms of teachers spending a large part of the time, instead of actually teaching the curriculum and engaging in student-centered learning, instead they're really talking about teaching to the test, and that's a serious consequence.
Thank you, Anne. Teaching to the test is a widely recognised phenomenon in England. I'm sure it is in many other countries too, and perhaps you'd like to comment on that in a moment. Ewan, do you want to add to that?
I agree with that completely. And even in organizations, if, for instance, you want to take maybe some funding, and you have so much benchmarks, what to do, what not to do, it could actually kill the project. And I strongly believe that one of the challenges of the Millennium Development Goals, the truth is, those indicators, those goals, some of them, the indicators are too tight, too hard for some of our developing countries to achieve. And so I think it's important that some of these indicators and benchmarks could be working against the intended goals. It's possible, very much.
Thank you very much. Now, there are questions over here on the right that I haven't picked up. Starting on the far right to begin with, who else would like to speak? So I've just got an indication. Yes, right, thank you.
Hello, my name's Di Fisher-Naylor, and I work for an organisation called Creativity, Culture and Education. We're based in the UK, but we work internationally. And my question is around this issue of measurement, and particularly the measurement of the 21st century skills, the creative skills, the skills which I guess in most education systems aren't measured at the moment. Within CC, we've been developing an approach to measure creativity. Our programme very much focuses on developing the creativity of children and young people in school, but also very much works with teachers as well around teacher development to do that child-centred learning, to look at creative pedagogy. So teachers, I mean, we describe it as being less teaching and more learning. My question really is, we have started to do a piece of work which is around measuring progression in creativity particularly, and we have been doing some field trial work on that. We're working with the OECD and Winchester University in the UK on this. But what I'd be really interested to learn, whether there are anybody else who's attempted this. At the moment, the programme of work that we're doing is suggesting it is just formative, but we're hoping that it will eventually lead to being a summative tool which will be applicable elsewhere. But we are very keen to learn from other people who've attempted this, from the conference and obviously from the speakers on the panel today.
Thank you very much. Just one thought before I hand over to our two experts. I can't talk about measuring creativity, although I am aware of the work of the University of Winchester here. There is, in England at any rate, a significant attempt to design sophisticated instruments for measuring what are called, wrongly in my view, but what are called soft outcomes. So you might be aware of a lot of work to develop instruments to measure, for example, confidence and self-esteem and self-worth, and to look at the relationship between an educational program on the one hand and the development of confidence on the other, and then what we know a lot less about and we need to know a lot more about, the relationship between improved confidence and self-esteem on the one hand and subsequent educational progress on the other. But to get back to creativity and measuring that and what we know about that, who'd like to pick up? Anne, can I turn to you first?
It puts a lot of pressure on teachers to actually assess all of these softer dimensions and so forth. In the United States, I was engaged in a project in the state of Kentucky where the teachers were very reticent, and they were pretty rebellious in terms of taking on this. They were much more comfortable with the standardized achievement tests. And what we did is we introduced a network of master teachers that were experts and provided them with a rubric in terms of how to actually assess creativity, problem-solving skills, writing skills, as you mentioned, John, and so forth, which took the responsibility away from the classroom teacher. So the teacher actually had a network of colleagues that that were skilled in terms of being able to assess and evaluate the merits of the students' work. And that actually worked. With that kind of technology, the technology that we have today, it's very easy to establish a network, and that's what I would suggest in terms of going, so that we don't overburden the classroom teacher with not only the standardized achievement tests, but 15 other constructs that we think are important as well.
Thank you, Anne, and perhaps we'll get a response to that in a moment. Ewan, do you want to add to that?
I've never had creativity measurement. I don't know. I know about learning, and I think, I don't know, creativity. I know. If you want to apply for a job, for instance, they do you IQ, intelligent quotient, and they do EQ, emotional quotient as well. I've never been involved in creativity measurement, no.
Okay. All right, thank you. Did you want to respond to what Anne was saying?
I think that's really interesting, and I think one of the things which I've learned already today is the possibility to find ways to get children to measure their own creativity. I think I've been really excited about some of the new technology applications that may be available, which can support children to measure their own creativity and their progression in it too. And I'm keen to talk to some people who've managed to do that, yes, for other forms of education and perhaps not around measuring creativity, but I think there may be some real potential to, yes, as you say, remove it from the teacher, because we know that teachers are already heavily burdened and spend significant time doing, testing and marking testing and looking at other forms of achievement. But we do think it's worth considering and seeing whether actually we can encourage children to think about it and use technology to do that.
We've actually used peer nomination in cooperative learning groups, where children who are working together collaboratively on a project will actually nominate the most creative, the most innovative, and so forth, and it gets them to think. Of course, that has to be facilitated with children, so that children are not, their nominations are constructive rather than punitive.
This takes us into the domain of the measures that we use and how far we also turn to learners themselves or groups of learners, and how far we can safely rely upon what is called self-report, which is traditionally thought of as rather unreliable amongst many in the research community. But there are others who suggest that, at any rate, evidence from testimony from learners themselves, whether in groups or individuals, is a valuable additional piece of data. Thank you. A question over here. Two. First, second.
Thank you. Steve London from Link Community Development. I'm based in South Africa. I've found the contributions really interesting. from where I'm coming from, we've been designing approaches for in 5 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, including South Africa, for district level structures. You mentioned districts earlier, for them to measure school performance with a view that that information is available at school level, informs district planning, but critically to start to build up the level of understanding by parents and community as to what their entitlements might be, as well as what their responsibilities are. Now, one of the challenges, I've been listening to what you're saying, but one of the challenges we felt, and we found, we contracted in former Ofsted people, former HMI people to help us develop this. In order to take something to scale that can be delivered by a district, you have to compromise on the range of indicators that you might use. And it's interesting, we've been trying this for about 15 years or so now, that there are relatively few systems that seem to go to scale, that focus on the parent and community as the recipient of information to inform demand-side pressure on schools. Most of it seems to be on the research base of, and then the more purist around corruption of data, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to get your views on that, particularly where you're coming from in terms of your experience and what you're now doing in Jordan, where I assume from what you're saying, it is about the system getting information and about different users in the system getting information. And just a point on that, just to end, where we talked about literacy and numeracy. I mean, I started today by having an SMS from my wife telling me that my 6-year-old has got 100% pass in a Olympiad maths test in our region in Gauteng. I'm very pleased with that, actually. I don't think, as a parent, that that's the only indicator, only measure. I see it as one thing, and that helps reinforce our sense that we're doing okay, what we're doing at home, what we're doing in school. So I think there's also a tendency that when we're looking at this a purer sense, that we stop looking at the fact that indicators are an indicator. They're not everything. We're not trying to, and we can't inspect every element of learning. We're looking at proxies. If you're trying to take things to scale, don't you have no choice? Isn't that the only option you have?
Thank you. I'll turn to Anne first and then you.
You're absolutely correct. The reality is that we have to have really much stronger, what I call theories of change. We have to identify what are the mechanisms that are going to push educational reform and optimize the learning experience for children, and that's what we should be measuring. Obviously, indicators are, in fact, as you said, they don't represent the child. They are proxy representations in terms of the child's learning and knowledge trajectory, and we have to be able to work with those and contextualize that. So the perfect score is going to say not only it's going to say multiple things, that you and your family are doing well by your child, that the child is having an optimal experience in school, so the teacher's doing something as well. The demand side of education in terms of evaluation it's working in the United States. You can get on websites. If you're moving to a location, you can find out right down to the building level what the school grades are, the proportion of children who are reading at or above grade level, mathematics and science and so forth. And the presumption is that people will choose to live in those communities and not to live in communities where children aren't doing well. And then the demand will go away, those schools will close and so forth. That never does, because obviously it's in some communities, people don't have the resources to live. They have to make do with something. So the transparency of data is important. It's a necessary but insufficient condition to bring things to scale.
Thank you, Anne. Ewan, do you want to add to that? No? All right. Thank you. I think we've got time. Thank you for that question. For one last question in the front here. Two of you, several of you, I'll have to see whether I'm permitted to. Do we have one more minute? One more question. Clear instruction, so apologies to those of you we can't get onto. One last question.
Yes. Eugenia Potulicka, Poland, Polish Comparative Education Association. Education reform in the United States is very much based on standards and tests. The impact of tests on students, on teachers, and on schools is so serious that some states play games with the system of accountability. Do you think this reform has positive, from educational point of view, effects or not? A difficult question. And is Barack Obama successful with his race to the top? Thank you.
Nice, easy question to finish with.
Well, we're racing to the top because we left a lot of children behind, which was the educational reform prior to that. You're absolutely correct. What some states are doing and what some school districts are doing is that our standardized achievement tests are taken largely in the winter months in February and March. And in January, right after our holiday season, a lot of children find themselves in special education classes. They are accommodated. They still take the tests, but their scores are not included in the school score. That has serious consequences for children, because as children are identified as special needs, they go into different educational programs, and oftentimes if they're identified early on, they are never allowed to get outside of that trajectory. The standardized achievement test has not worked. Leave No Child Behind was a failure because it was largely unfunded. Barack Obama has not gotten any traction in Congress. We have a stalemate right now, and we're much more focused on not electing our sitting president than we are at doing what we need to do for children. So race to the top right now is unfortunately rhetoric. And I'm much more optimistic about the evaluations I'm doing in the MENA region than I am in terms of the evaluations I'm doing in my own country.
Thank you. I think that was a direct answer to your questions. I'm afraid that we need to conclude. Thank you for your questions. I'm sure you probably have more, and we're here to take more later. I hope we've only touched the surface, of course, but we've talked a little bit about some of the more technical aspects, but also about some of the political aspects too. The next plenary session is at 5 o'clock. I need to ask you to return your headsets before leaving, and there's one other thing I must ask you, and that is to show your appreciation to our two experts here. Thank you very much.